On the coast of modern-day Syria, archaeologists found a message that was never sent. It was baked into clay nearly 3,200 years ago. A king writing to his ally in a panic, his city already surrounded. He wrote that enemy ships had been spotted offshore. He begged for immediate help. He said his own soldiers and chariots were away, fighting somewhere else, and his city was defenseless. The tablet was found still sitting in the kiln, never finished, never sent, because within days the city of Ugarit was burned to the ground and never rebuilt again. This wasn't an isolated disaster. Within a span of fewer than 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, Ugarit, and dozens of smaller kingdoms. Trade routes that had connected 3 continents vanished overnight. Writing itself disappeared in some regions for centuries. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. And after 100 years of research, we still don't fully agree on what caused it. Hey friend, glad you found your way here again, because this is one of the strangest mysteries in ancient history, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why historians still argue about it today. Around 1200 BC, the ancient world was at its peak. Egypt controlled a vast empire. The Hittites ruled much of modern Turkey with one of the most advanced militaries on earth. Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the Trojan War, was wealthy, literate, and deeply connected by trade. Then, within 2 or 3 generations, almost all of it was gone. Cities were burned, palaces abandoned. International trade networks that had linked Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and the Near East for centuries simply stopped functioning. Some regions didn't recover for 300 years. So what actually happened? A single invasion? A natural disaster? Or something stranger, a slow-motion collapse that had been building for decades before anyone noticed? Stick around, because the real answer is more unsettling than any single explanation. To understand how strange this collapse really was, you first need to understand how connected the Bronze Age world actually was. This wasn't a scattering of isolated kingdoms. By 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean functioned almost like an ancient international economy. Egyptian gold flowed north. Cypriot copper and Anatolian tin combined to make bronze, the material that gave the entire age its name, and that bronze depended on trade routes stretching across multiple empires. Royal families intermarried across cultures. Kings wrote diplomatic letters to each other as equals. We still have hundreds of these letters, called the Amarna letters, showing Egyptian pharaohs negotiating with Babylonian and Hittite kings, almost like modern heads of state. Ugarit, the city whose unsent letter we opened with, was one of the great hubs of this system. Its harbor connected Egyptian ships, Cypriot copper traders, and Anatolian caravans. Archaeologists have found cuneiform tablets and at least 7 different languages there, evidence of a genuinely cosmopolitan trading center. This is the critical detail. The Bronze Age world wasn't a set of separate civilizations that happened to collapse at the same time by coincidence. It was one interconnected system, and interconnected systems don't fail in isolated pieces. When one piece breaks, it can drag the rest down with it. Keep that idea in mind, because it's going to matter a lot by the end of this video. The first major clue historians found came from Egypt. Egyptian temple inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe a terrifying enemy arriving by sea and by land. a confederation of different peoples the Egyptians called, in their own records, simply the peoples of the sea. These weren't a single nation or army. Egyptian texts list several distinct groups traveling together: the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Denaian, and others, names historians still debate the exact origins of. Some researchers connect them to the Aegean world, others to Anatolia, others to a mixed coalition of displaced peoples from many regions at once. What we do know is this: they arrived not just as raiders, but as entire migrating populations. Egyptian carvings at Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu show ox carts loaded with women and children traveling alongside warriors. This wasn't a military campaign. It looked more like a mass migration under pressure, as if entire populations were fleeing something, not just conquering for its own sake. Ramesses III claims to have defeated them in 2 major battles, one on land and one at sea, and Egypt survived, badly weakened, but standing. Almost everyone else wasn't so lucky. The Hittite Empire, one of the 3 or 4 great powers of the age, collapsed entirely around this time. Their capital, Hattusa, was abandoned and burned. A civilization that had rivaled Egypt for over a century essentially vanished from history within a generation. Mycenaean Greece fared just as badly. Palace after palace was destroyed: Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and the sophisticated bureaucratic writing system the Mycenaeans used, called Linear B, disappeared completely. Greece entered what historians literally call a dark age, centuries where population dropped, literacy vanished, and the archaeological record goes nearly silent. For decades, the sea peoples were treated as the simple answer, barbarian invaders from outside who toppled a peaceful, prosperous world. But here's the problem. The more archaeologists dig, the less that simple story holds up. If the sea peoples alone caused the collapse, you'd expect clear evidence of a single invading force sweeping through the region in a short, violent campaign. That's not what the evidence shows. First, the timing doesn't line up cleanly. Some cities were destroyed years, even decades, apart from each other, not in one coordinated wave. Ugarit's destruction and the fall of Hattusa aren't perfectly simultaneous events. They're spread across a Messier longer timeline. Second, climate scientists have found strong evidence of a severe, prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean in exactly this period. Pollen samples and sediment cores from the region show a sharp, sustained dry period beginning in the late 13th century BC. This wasn't a bad harvest. It may have been a decades-long climate shift. Third, this was also a time of major earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a highly active seismic zone, and archaeologists have found what looks like earthquake damage, collapsed walls, skeletons crushed under fallen structures at multiple Bronze Age sites, sometimes layered right alongside signs of fire and destruction. Some researchers call this pattern an earthquake storm, a cluster of major quakes hitting an already weakened region across a compressed span of time. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, internal records suggest some of these societies were already struggling before any outside attack arrived. Hittite texts describe famine and desperate grain shipments from Egypt years before their capital fell. Some cities show signs of internal unrest, abandoned buildings, disrupted trade that predate any apparent violent destruction. So which is it? Invasion, drought, earthquakes, or internal collapse? The uncomfortable answer many historians now favor is all of them at once, feeding into each other. This is where we go back to that idea from earlier, the Bronze Age world as one interconnected system. Remember, bronze itself required tin and copper from different regions, meaning every kingdom depended on long-distance trade just to arm its own military. Grain shortages in one region could be offset by imports from another, as long as the trade network stayed intact. Now imagine that system under mounting stress. Prolonged drought reduces harvests across multiple kingdoms simultaneously, not just one. Reduced harvests mean less grain to trade, less wealth to pay soldiers and officials, and more desperate, hungry populations. Earthquakes damage ports and cities that the trade network depends on. In other words, the Sea Peoples may not have been the single cause of the collapse. They may have been one symptom of a much larger crisis, displaced, desperate populations set in motion by the same climate and resource pressures that were already breaking the great kingdoms from within. Under this theory, historians describe the Bronze Age collapse as a systems collapse, not one dramatic invasion, but a network of interconnected societies that had become so specialized and interdependent that when several shocks hit at once, climate, earthquakes, famine, migration, and internal unrest, the entire system didn't just weaken. It unraveled completely, and it unraveled fast, because the very interconnection that had made the Bronze Age world so prosperous also made it fragile. This is genuinely one of the reasons modern historians and even some economists study this period, because it may be one of the earliest recorded examples of what happens when a complex, interconnected system fails under compounding pressure rather than a single cause. Not everything fell. Egypt survived, though badly weakened and diminished, as a great power. Assyria endured and would later grow into a dominant empire in its own right. Some smaller communities in the Levant and Cyprus adapted and continued. But the world that emerged afterward looked nothing like the one before. The great palace-based bureaucracies were gone. International trade on the old scale didn't return for centuries. In Greece, writing itself disappeared for roughly 400 years. The later Greeks who developed the alphabet we associate with classical Greece had no memory of linear B at all. And there's a strange irony in what eventually rose from the wreckage. The interruption of old trade routes and old political structures forced surviving communities toward new technologies and new political forms. Iron, cheaper and more widely available than bronze, which required trade and scarce tin, began replacing bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons in the centuries that followed. Some historians argue the very collapse of the old trade-dependent bronze economy is part of what accelerated the shift into what we now call the Iron Age. The old world had to break completely before a new one could take its place. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries, not because we have too little evidence, but because we have evidence pointing in several directions at once, and reality was probably messier than any single explanation. If a fully interconnected, technologically advanced network of civilizations could collapse this completely, in this short a time, it raises an uncomfortable question about how fragile any interconnected system really is, including the ones we depend on today. If you want to see what a single, more contained downfall looks like, one man, one bribe, one government brought to its knees. That's the story I'm telling you next.